2. And make sure everyone's muted. Cool, cool.
How's everybody doing? Everybody okay?
Yes, thank you.
Good. So I'm going to try and move this little green thing out of the way. Okay. So tonight we are going to take a few minutes and discuss something kind of from a different perspective. And oh, I didn't update from last time because we were going to do this in October and we had some technical difficulties. And we'll update this to the 29th of November. But I want to come at the whole question of Wyandot and Wyandotte, why we have two different spellings of the name, kind of from a different look. Those of us that are either Wyandot and Wyandotte, do we have both nations represented tonight? Do we have any Wyandot Nation of Kansas with us? I didn't notice anyone. Are we all Wyandot Nation? Is anybody not Wyandot Nation? Oh, there's Kristen. But there's been a lot of questions over the years why we have two different Wyandottes. We have Wyandot Nation of Kansas and we have Wyandot Nation, which prior to that, we were the Wyandot tribe of Oklahoma. And too many questions have been raised as to why Wyandot and Wyandotte. So when Kim and I was looking at topics at the first of the year, we wanted to talk about the differences in the spelling of the name and how all this came about. But rather than just jump in there and look at why we have two different nations now, I wanted to look at all of the things, or a good number of the things that led up to the two different spellings. And what has happened with the Wyandot people, the Huron-Wyandot people, is not really any different with many of the other nations out there, because there are a number of nations that have different variations, different nations within the nation, if you will. So Wyandot Nation, Wyandot Nation of Kansas, and the Wyandot of Wyandotte Nation is not unique among the Wyandot people. There are plenty of other nations out there that have different nations of the same people, if that makes any sense. So looking at our topics here, we're going to look at some notable moves and splits. There were two monumental years that were huge for the Huron-Wyandot people. Secrets of the Lodge, elites, orphans, and incompetence, and an adoptive move. And all of this should kind of piece together why in 1854 we ended up having 1855 we ended up having the split within the Wyandot people. And just so that everybody is very much aware, Wyandot people have had a number of splits, a number of disagreements within the tribe, to the point where over the last 350 years, we've had some disagreements and plenty of them. So what happened in 1854, 1855 is really nothing new, nor was it the first time that we had a major split within the tribe. So the issues regarding the spelling of the names and potential reunification of the three bands are a social and political nightmare. Many people become confused, others combative, and some sympathetic to a cause they truly do not understand. Many generations have passed since the Wyandot split into three bands, and it's hard for many to accept the reality of the fate as still being binding. Others seem to carry a grudge for reasons they cannot remember. So what has happened within the Wyandot people has caused some unfortunate animosity over the years. And hopefully tonight we can kind of set some of those misunderstandings aside and we can move on and create a very hopeful future for all of the Wyandot peoples. The Huron-Wyandot people, as I said, have experienced a lot of internal strife. And if you look at the way in which we became a nation, it kind of makes sense why there would be some disagreements, because we are basically, at minimum, 3 different nations that came together in some of the most traumatic events of the lives of the people and formed a new nation, basically out of war. So we have 3 different people groups with very common similarities that came together and made the Wyandot people as we are today. Those similarities that they had allowed for them to bind and unify as a single group of people, but the differences that they also shared allowed them to always remember who they were and from where they came. And the 3 different people groups always had some differences in loyalties toward religion. There were a number of our ancestors that were very devout Catholics. There were a number of our ancestors that were extremely devout to the old way of life. And even though it wasn't a religion, they were dedicated to that way of life. There were loyalties to the tribe. There were loyalties to foreign powers, because we have always had some differences within the nation as to allegiance between the French, the British, the Americans, and those foreign powers caused a lot of division within the nation. But some of the most pristine, some of the most solid features of the nation was loyalty to your clan. There was never any forced loyalty to a clan. It was a given, and it was a buffer for the stability of tribal society, that the clans were always as strong as they were. And there was never any disloyalty to the clan. If there was any disloyalty in the clans, then those individuals were dealt with swiftly so that there would not be any type of a toxic society that was brewed within the clans. By the late 1730s, which by the 1730s, that is only 80 years after our dispersal from the Ontario homelands. So within 80 years of becoming a new nation, there were a lot of very easy to recognize differences within the tribe. And some of those differences go back as early as 1701, because whenever we left the area of Mackinac Bay, Michilimackinac, there was one group of Wyandottes that left, and others took up to 3 years before they would finally move. So there's a little split right there within 50 years of the nation. 1747, other notable splits: 1763, 1815, 1844, 1857, 1867, 1887, 1904. You can see here that there's a pattern where there were significant different disagreements within the tribe. We have now, for the longest time, had a lot of stability. For over 100 years, we've not had a significant split within our peoples. So in 1828, this is where a lot of the problems began. In 1828, the clans were severely compromised. And remember, there was extreme loyalty in the clans. And through that loyalty in the clans, there was this devout loyalty that was given to the tribe. The clans made the tribe, and the clans needed each other. And through the betterment of the tribe, the clans had a lot of more strength together in unity. So in 1828, the clans were severely compromised. By 1843, the clans were notably absent during removal. The clans didn't have much of anything that they were involved with when we left Ohio and Michigan in 1843. Wyandot citizens remained in Canada for fear of U.S. reprisals, because many of the Wyandottes that went across the Detroit River into Canada did so because they had aligned themselves with the British. Many did not want to leave Canada for fear that the United States
I'm having trouble hearing. Is anyone else?
Yes, his Lloyd's sound dropped out at my end.
Yeah, I did mine too.
Same here.
Well,
Get-
unfortunately, I cannot really control the stability of anything beyond what's here on this computer.
We hear you again.
Okay.
Can you
So,
back up? You were talking, you dropped out when you were starting to talk about, if I'm not mistaken, when around 1843, right around in there. Is that correct, guys?
Yes,
in 1843, when we left Ohio, the unity and strength in the clans was noticeably absent. There was not really any clan unity, any participation in the removal from Michigan and Ohio. And because of that, whenever the Wyandot citizens that remained in Canada, they remained there for a multitude of reasons. There was fear of reprisals from the United States government, because many of the Wyandot citizens that were in the Detroit area actually sided with the British during the War of 1812. So many of the Canadian Wyandottes did not want to leave Canada because they thought they would get in trouble if they went back across the Detroit River. Many of the Wyandot citizens also remained in Canada because they just didn't want to leave. Down in Ohio, we had Wyandot citizens that remained in Ohio because of fear of slavery. The Indian Territory was built right next to the state of Missouri, which was a slave state. And there were a number of our citizens in Ohio that were actually African-American, and they did not want to leave Ohio because they felt that if they left Ohio, they would be brought back into slavery from where they had come from. And then, just like in Canada, there were a number of citizens that did not want to leave Ohio. So by the time we left Ohio in 1843, there was a split within the tribe from those that didn't want to leave and go to Indian Territory. The Wyandot Nation of Androdon, the Androdons, basically became Canadian citizens. And by that time, they were functioning as an independent tribe. So by if you look at the history, by 1847, 1845, we already at that point in time had two nations. We had the Wyandots in Canada. We had the Wyandots that actually moved to Indian Territory that became Kansas. By 1846, the Wyandots that moved to Indian Territory in Kansas began to notice that they had some problems with their clan rights. The clan rights were basically gone. All citizens had basically gained their rights within the clan, and there was no rights within the tribe itself. All of your rights and all of your duties were clan-based, not tribe-based. By 1846, the clans were gone, and a constitution was first written in 1846 to replace some of those clan rights that were now notably absent. There was only one tribal right in the 1846 Constitution. The only right given to citizens was the privilege of being in trial or on trial for murder and being judged over by 21 of their peers. So the replaced Constitution for the clan rights did not give many.
Hey,
So
Lloyd,
by the mid 18, yes,
you were cutting out real quick. Sorry.
I can't do a thing about that, guys. I'm sorry.
I would rather you pause and let you know, but
Okay.
you're good now.
You were at the privilege of a trial by 21 when you cut out.
Well, the clan rights that the people had were gone, and the only tribal right that the people had was trial by 21 peers in the event of a murder that took place in the tribe. So the tribe was feeling a lot of stress. There was a tremendous amount of unrest within the people, and the government that was being implemented by the time we moved to Indian Territory was taking more and more and more rights of the citizens away from the citizens. The monumental years of 1846 and 1848 were huge. And here we start to see some splits began to affect the Wyandot tribe that had moved to Indian Territory. The first constitution was implemented in 1846. At that same time, in 1846, the Methodist Episcopal Church split over the differences of slavery and freedom. The tribe was very loyal and very invested in the Methodist Episcopal Church. So when the Methodist Episcopal Church split, the tribe also split down the lines of slavery and freedom. The Wyandottes in general were completely anti-slavery. That's why we had the African-American population on the Grand Reserve, because we harbored and gave protection and freedom to a lot of the escaped slaves that didn't make it to Canada. In 1846, there was some stress that was put on the tribe because a lot of the old feasts, a lot of the old ways of celebrating the oneness with nature and the Great Spirit was also compromised. And there was a split between the traditional as well as the contemporaries when most of the ancient feasts were set aside and combined into the green corn feast. So we're starting to see a lot of stresses within those old traditions. By 1848, more stress comes into the tribe. The Wyandot purchase that we made from the Delaware tribe was finally affirmed by the United States Senate. So the land that we had been working at the confluence of the Kansas and Missouri River since 1844 was finally ours. It was legally ours. Almost immediately when we could say that we had land that belonged to us in Indian Territory, the Wyandottes reinitiated the Northwest Confederacy. As we were known, the Wyandottes were keepers of the council fire. We had the right to call council. So we called a council of all the nations that were former members of the Northwest Confederacy. And some of our elites within the tribe implemented a very secret agenda that they had been harboring for quite some time. The whole Nebraska territory was put into play in 1848, which caused some separation within the tribe between those who had loyalties toward the Wyandot tribe and those within the tribe that began to express loyalties to this new desired Nebraska territory. And the Nebraska territory was a dream of William Walker Jr. William was an absolute genius. William could see things in the future that people couldn't really piece together. And William knew that the Indian Territory was destined to be gobbled up by the United States. So he came up with this plan. He and a few other people came up with this plan. And I won't take the time to read the quote here, but William basically gathered all the tribes together with the intent to create a territory of the United States of America that was governed by the Indians. William's dream was to have a territory where the white people did not have the ability to tell the Indians what to do. And the only way to do that was to create a territory of the United States that was governed by the Indians. When we left Ohio in 1843, there was a very small number of citizens that were Freemasons. And William Walker Jr. was one of the most influential of the tribe's Freemasons. And when William came to the United States territory, we'd already mentioned there that he wanted to create that government territory that was governed by the Indians. And for this to have happened, what William was not really forthright in telling the Wyandot citizens about was they were going to have to eventually give up their United States or their tribal citizenship for United States citizenship. So this little secret implemented agenda was put into play, and a lot of things were being withheld from tribal citizens as this agenda was being put into motion with the other tribes. And loyalty to the citizen, or loyalty of the citizens, were beginning to be stretched within the clans, because by this time, the clans were compromised to the point that a lot of the ancient loyalties to the clans were beginning to be no more of a concern for the tribal government that was put into play. The clans no longer had the ability to come together and keep their own citizens loyal to the big turtle, the little turtle, the deer, the wolf, and all the other clans. All of the tribes found in Indian country were facing unprecedented changes as many ancient rituals within the tribes began to fade within the hidden secrets of the Longhouse. They were easily replaced by rituals found within the hidden secrets of the Lodge. Could it be that some of the affluent and elite Wyandot men turned their attention to Masonic traditions to replace Huron-Wyandot traditions? I have asked that in the new book that I've got, because we can begin to see where the traditions of the Wyandot tribe was coming under attack. And this new government that the elites were putting into play began to focus more on the needs of this new Nebraska territory than the needs of the tribe to whom they were citizens of. And many of the elites that were putting in play the Nebraska territory were members of the Masonic Lodge. The elites, orphans, and incompetents became focus of the tribe. The Wyandot tribe became dominated by the elites. Tribal citizens were misinformed, suppressed, and they became unimportant to tribal government. In 1848, the Wyandot Purchase, after it was affirmed, there was a call among citizens because they were beginning to see that there was this breakdown of ancient traditions. The Wyandot tribe was in serious jeopardy, and many of the tribal citizens made a call for the tribe to leave Indian territory and move to Minnesota territory. And basically, within 4 years of moving to Indian territory, start all over again. But that move to relocate out of Indian territory to Minnesota territory was squashed. That was put down pretty quick. In a proposal in the 1850 treaty, there was an amendment that was removed by the United States government. The proposal basically requested prematurely citizenship for Wyandot citizens. However, the United States government was not in favor of that happening, because Indian territory was put in place as a temporary fix for the United States government. The United States government needed all these tribes that had been removed from the Northwest to stay in place as a buffer against Missouri, so that the slavery issue would be basically held in check. The tribes were put along the western border of Missouri, kind of as a checkmate for slavery to keep it from moving. The government wouldn't let the citizens implement a request for citizenship because they still needed the tribes. In 1854, the Missouri Compromise was abolished because the United States government found out what the Wyandot tribe was doing, or the elites of the Wyandot tribe was doing. They were trying to create this territory for the Indians. And the United States government did not want these Indians to create a territory. So they went against William Walker Jr., who had been put into place as the territorial governor. And the Missouri Compromise was abolished, and the territories of Kansas and Nebraska were put into play, basically to stop what the Indians were doing. However, in 1855, United States citizenship was again proposed, and this time the United States government accepted the Wyandot's offer for citizenship, because now with Kansas and Nebraska, the territories put into place, they did not need the Indians. The Indians were now expendable. Chief Tarami in 1855 opposed the treaty. He was defiant. He refused to sign. He refused to give up his Wyandot citizenship. And out of all of the 617 citizens in 1855 that were accounted for, there were only 148 Wyandot citizens that remained tribal citizens and refused to take United States citizenship. So 148 out of 617 sounds pretty respectfully good, but most of those 148 citizens could not function in society because they could not speak or write English. They could only speak Wyandot. Many of those 148 citizens that refused United States citizenships were also juveniles. They were orphans that could not make decisions for themselves, so they were children. The split was harsh in 1855 over the U.S. citizenship versus retaining Wyandot citizenship. The problem is, in 1855, there was no hope of a chance that the Wyandot people could continue on as a unified group of people. The tribe was abolished. The tribe had a limited time in which to function and operate, and then there would be no more Wyandot people, period. In 1857, Matthew Mudeater, who had accepted United States citizenship, led a small band to Indian Territory. That's a huge move that would prove very important in the coming years. From 1855 to 67, the historic Wyandot tribe split into two factions: Citizen Party versus Indian Party. Silas Armstrong and Matthew Mudeater emerged as the prominent leaders of the Christian Party. Tarami, who's also known as John Hatt, and John Wesley Gray Eyes emerged as prominent leaders within the Indian Party. So now we have two different groups of Wyandots that are vying to become Wyandots again, if that makes any sense. John Wesley Gray Eyes had accepted United States citizenship, but he recanted that United States citizenship. Unfortunately, his recanting was irrelevant, just like a number of other citizens who recanted their United States citizenship. It didn't mean anything. They could not recant their citizenship. Tarami, and this is where a big problem came into play. Tarami despised, he hated, he looked at the Wyandot citizens who accepted United States citizenship with disdain, and he looked at them with a vile hatred because he saw that as being disloyal to the tribe. Tarami, he played favoritism, and he would choose and he would accept only a few Wyandot citizens into his party. So Tarami became very vengeful during his time of leadership over the Citizen Party, over the Indian Party. And he was not being fair for those who wanted to recant their citizenship to the United States, and he created problems. At the start of the U.S. Civil War, Tarami and a bunch of other citizens were living on Seneca land, and they were taken hostage by the Seneca and the Cherokee. They were not given a choice. They were basically told that they had to be loyal to the Confederacy. They did not submit. After being taken captive, they eventually escaped their bondage, and they remained loyal to the Union and then fled back to Wyandot City. They were classified then as refugee Indians. It is because of that classification of being refugee Indians that the Wyandot tribe was reinstated in 1867. Because of that loyalty to the Union, because of refusing to go with the Confederacy, that small group of refugee Indians allowed for the Wyandots to be reinstated. From 1867 to 72, Wyandot tribal government was horrid. They were disorganized, they were corrupt, they were incapable of leading. They could not put together a viable government because of individuals such as Abelard Guthrie. Abelard was the mate of Nancy Quindaro Brown, and he embezzled hundreds and hundreds and thousands of dollars from the citizens of the tribe. the reinstated tribe. And he eventually got caught, but there were other individuals such as Abelard, who was taking advantage of the tribe, who kept the tribe in total turmoil, taking funds away from the tribe and causing a lot of disarray to potentiate throughout the years of 1867 to 72. Tarami died in 1870, and all of the unfairness and all of the disdain that he had towards citizens who accepted United States citizenship died with him. And the adoption process became fair at that point. So by 1871, John Kyrahu was acting as chief of the tribe. The problem is he was trying to govern the tribe reorganized in territory from Quindaro, Kansas, which is north of Kansas City. Because of his failures, there became a unexpressed and unwritten law within the tribe. You had to request, by the Treaty of 1867, you had to request adoption back into the tribe if you had accepted United States citizenship. And then a continuation of that, because of John Kyraho, you had to actually move to Indian Territory. If you did not move to Indian Territory, you were not formally accepted back into the tribe as a reinstated citizen. And that caused a lot of problems for a lot of citizens who were unaware of that requirement to move. The Dawes Act of 1877 further created problems for the tribe. By 1877, all of the reservation in Indian Territory was allotted to the citizens who were actually physically living in Indian Territory. The citizens that were still in Kansas were not allotted any land. Because of that, they became known as the absentee Wyandot. The absentee Wyandot could not at that point get any land for themselves in Indian Territory. They tried to get land from other tribes because they had accepted United States citizenship. They were barred from getting any land from any of the other tribes that were also in Indian Territory. By 1904, when the olive roll was taken, the absentee Wyandot were given land throughout other places in the western part of the United States that did not belong to Indian Territory. And the result of that is what caused the absentee Wyandot, the Wyandot Nation of Kansas, the citizen Wyandot from being allowed reinstatement back into the Wyandot tribe when the 37 Constitution was put into play. As a result of all of this, this is why we have now the Wyandot Nation of Anderdon, and they actually became a standalone nation as early as 1847. Wyandot Nation of Kansas and the Wyandot Nation have become very, I'm trying to be careful here, very contentious over the last 100 years over the rights to the land. And we shouldn't do that because we're all Wyandots who have unfortunately found ourselves on one side of the divide or the other out of a lot of unfortunate fate and circumstances that were not something that the people could clearly understand and make some rational decisions for themselves. Granted, in saying that, there were some citizens who chose to stay in Kansas who did not want to move to Indian Territory. They were comfortable, they had a good life, they had money, they had success, they had power, they had position, and they chose to retain their United States citizenship over giving up that to become a Wyandot citizen again. So we had a lot of people who lost their ability to become Wyandot Nation citizens out of fate. We had others who personally chose to retain United States citizenship in favor of being a Wyandot Indian. So that can hopefully allow us to see the complexities that were involved in the split of 1855. It's not black, it's not white. There's a lot of gray involved in it. There's a lot of really difficult things to talk through. And hopefully after this, we can open up a really good solid dialogue so that some of the wounds and injuries that we've sustained for over 150 years now can begin to mend clearly and strong again as a Wyandot people. And all the sources for that. And that's all. So guys, that was a very long, very complicated, quickly condensed overview of how we got to the point of having Wyandot and Wyandotte. There's got to be some questions.
Can you go back to the 16, slide 16, I think?
Slide 16 right there. Mhm.
Yeah, okay, so I want to make sure I got this right. The Andron and the Wyandot Nation of Kansas got land in 1904?
Not really.
Okay,
The Wyandot Nation, the Wyandot of Wyandotte Nation, they did not get land in the United States until recently. They stayed in Canada. They stayed in Canada well until the early 20th century, and then they began to slowly move back over into the Detroit area. When they moved back over into the Detroit area, they basically just integrated themselves into society. So they didn't get any land in 1904 because they were still up in the Detroit area. The Wyandot Nation of Kansas, they received some land, but it was land that was given to individuals. And that land was spread throughout the western states of the United States. So there was no way that the Wyandot Nation of Kansas today, the absentee Wyandot in 1904, could have consolidated that land and come together as a tribe and resided on the land that they got from the olive roll, because it was 80 acres here, it was 80 acres there, it was 80 acres in Arizona, it was 80 acres in Kansas, it was 80 acres throughout all the western states. And they did not have the ability to.
and it went to individuals rather than the
Correct.
government.
That is correct.
And am I correct that only the Wyandot Nation of Oklahoma is recognized as a federal tribe?
That is
Correct.
correct.
And
Yes.
can you talk more about that? Or is that a whole nother topic?
That can get a little complex. We could talk about it really briefly.
Okay,
In 1855, when the tribe was dissolved, the treaty allowed for a small time continuum, if you will, that was undesignated for a certain duration of time that the Wyandot tribe would have to basically shut down. The ambiguous statement, the clause in there basically allowed the tribe to continue on until the final business was done. And because of that continuation of business, the jump, if you will, from the Wyandot tribe to the Wyandotte tribe, W-Y-A-N-D-O-T to W-Y-A-N-D-O-T-T-E, was kind of a seamless jump. The tribe lost all recognition in 1855. It basically came to a final shutdown, and then the battle between the Citizen Party and the Indian Party jumped into play. So in 1867, when the tribe was basically reinstated, the chief who was the head chief in 1855, being Tarami, became the head chief in 1867 by default when the Wyandot tribe, W-Y-A-N-D-O-T-T-E, tribe was reinstated. So that continuation of Tarami to Tarami from Wyandot tribe to Wyandotte tribe allowed for the reinstatement of the Wyandot tribe, W-Y-A-N-D-O-T-T-E. Because of the reinstatement of the Wyandot tribe from Tarami to Tarami, Matthew Mudeater basically found himself sitting out there with no tribe to claim in order to get recognition. So that federal recognition was dropped basically on Tarami, who was the last head chief and the first head chief of the Wyandot tribe and Wyandotte tribe. Does that make sense?
Kind
So
of.
that continuation of federal recognition went from Tarami to Tarami.
Uh-huh.
And Matthew Mudeater, who was representing the Citizen Lloyd, basically lost everything. And all of those who recognized themselves as being Citizen Wyandotte found themselves in need of asking for adoption back into the Wyandotte tribe, Wyandotte, or basically lose their identity as Wyandottes and become United States citizens of American Indian heritage. That's quickly put in that who became recognized and who lost recognition. And it's from the Citizen Wyandotte who lost recognition in 1867 to the Indian Wyandotte. It's from the Citizen Wyandotte that we have the Wyandot Nation of Kansas. And it's from the Indian Wyandotte that we become the Wyandot Nation, who we are today.
Lloyd, about how many people were in Indian nation that came to Oklahoma? How many total people?
Some of the early censuses that were done show initial citizens who claimed to be Wyandot, Wyandotte, after asking for adoption back into the tribe. There was only numbers in the 180 to 200 citizens. So when the split occurred in 1855, we had roughly 600, to round it off, easy numbers. We had roughly 650 citizens. When that first census was done, we were down to about, again, rounded off, about 200. So only 200 were initially recognized as Wyandot, Wyandotte, tribal citizens from the 650 that initially existed in 55.
And,
Slowly.
I have a question from the 1888 allotment map.
Mhm.
Apparently not everyone was allotted property. Is that correct?
You had to be 18 years of age in order to get an allotment.
And
You also had to be resident on the Wyandot Reservation. You had to be recognized as a citizen of the Wyandot Nation. So unfortunately, if there were any Wyandot citizens, Wyandotte, citizens that were still living in Kansas, the state of Kansas, they were not in Indian territory to receive their land. They were not given land.
yeah, the reason I asked was when I looked at that, Isaiah Walker has no allotment, but Mary does, Mary Williams Walker.
Correct.
And so do the kids, Bert, Isaac, and Thomas. So yeah, that was interesting. So maybe he was still in Kansas. I don't know.
I think he was actually in Indian territory, and why she got the recognition for the allotment and he didn't. What year did he die? Do you remember?
Good question. I can find it.
Yeah, when did he fall in the well?
About
Was it
1883.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that right there tells you why, because he had already died when the Dawes Act came into play. So his land was given to Mary. By default, he took the land that should have been given to him because he had already died.
Makes sense.
Yeah, Isaiah Walker and Mary, they came down in 1874. They applied for citizenship to the Indian Party in 1874.
And many of our families were not in Indian territory in 1867. Like the Armstrongs, Eliza Armstrong Bland and her husband, John Bland, they did not move to Indian territory until 1871. And a lot of people have asked, why in 1867 weren't these people already in Indian territory? Well, I tried to express how disorganized the tribe was. It was absolute total chaos in Indian Territory. There was a lot of fighting, there was a lot of bickering, there was a lot of disunity, even among those who had been readopted back into the tribe. And a lot of our grandparents, great-great-great-grandparents, did not want to move their families into that chaos. And that chaos did not come into control until 1871, 1872. And that's when a lot of these citizens began to move from Kansas back down to Indian Territory. So you have the Blands, you have the Walkers, you have the Armstrongs, you have many of those citizens who began to pull up roots in Kansas and move to Indian Territory because it became safe for them to actually live on the land at that point. By that time, there were people who were moving back and forth between Kansas and Indian Territory. And we have some very vague reports of some of our citizens who were bushwhacked and killed. And it was just a very, very difficult time in which to truly move your family from Kansas to Indian Territory. So those moves were done later when things became stable.
Hey, Lloyd, somebody had requested that we have kind of maybe biopics of certain individuals like during that time. I would be interested in learning more about Tarami, and I know you've done a presentation on Matthew Medeator before, but maybe kind of those personal experiences would help us to understand it a little bit more. Not right now, obviously, but at some point.
Yeah, Tarami is a very interesting character. He would basically put a definition in any book of the bullheaded, the stubborn, the defiant attitude that some Wyandottes are known to have. He was a beast. Once he made up his mind, nothing could change him in his choices that he made. And he was difficult in thinking that his choices were the right choices. And anybody else who had a differing opinion were just downright wrong. But the interesting thing about Tarami is that he and Matthew Medeator were brother-in-laws. And here you have Tarami over the Indian Party Wyandot. You have Matthew Medeator over the Citizen Party Wyandot. They are brother-in-laws. They married sisters. And they became not so much bitter enemies, but they butted heads so hard in trying to become the leader of the reinstated Wyandottes. And Tarami, and if we know much about Matthew Medeator, which we've done a study on him, he was an imposing character himself. He was a Wyandotte. And for him to have beaten Matthew Medeator, Tarami was a powerful force to reckon with, as many of our Wyandot chiefs were.
You have one question in the chat and two people with their hands up.
Okay, let's see what's in the chat here. The bibliography page, the sources there, sure.
Don't leave it at.
What was that?
Wanted you to leave it up so I could do a screenshot of it. Thank you, Tishma.
Okay. Yeah, we will send out a PDF to everybody, which should hopefully make it a lot easier to peruse through some of these sources. So one of the questions was, who were the elites in the tribe and how did they become Freemasons? Who influenced them? Some of these questions are hard to answer because there's a lot of secrets in the Masonic Lodge. The elites that we know that were very influential were the Walker brothers, the Armstrongs. The two Armstrong brothers, you had Silas and you had John, oh goodness, just totally went blank. What was Silas's brother's name? Well, you had two sides of the Armstrong tree. You have Silas and you have John McIntyre. There we go. Silas and John McIntyre on one side of the Armstrong tree, and you have George on the other. And even within that split there between mothers, you have differences between Silas and and John and George, and then you have differences between Silas and John. So Silas was big in the Masonic Lodge, where John was not. So when I say the Armstrongs, I'm speaking more specifically of Silas. And to show how prominent the Armstrongs were in the Masonic Lodge, if you go to the cemetery in Wyandot, Oklahoma, that sits right behind the former administrative offices, and you go look at Silas Armstrong, who is commonly referred to as Silas Armstrong Jr., his stone bears the Masonic Lodge emblem. So the Masonic Lodge actually followed the tribe into Indian territory that became Oklahoma. Silas Armstrong Jr. was a citizen who became chief, and he was also a member of the Masonic Lodge, prominent member of the Masonic Lodge. So you had the Walkers, you had the Armstrongs, you had the Garretts, you had a number of other just individuals who did not represent families, if you will, who were prominent within the Masonic Lodge. William Walker Jr. was a Mason before he left Ohio. And William was also very loyal to the United States government before he left Ohio. He swore an oath to the United States government when he became the postmaster in Upper Sandusky. And he was tormented for the rest of his life over loyalty to the United States government, loyalty to the to the Wyandot tribe, and eventually loyalty to the Nebraska territory that he was so determined to put into play to save the nations. But the problem with his saving the nations by implementing the Nebraska territory is he had to destroy the nations to save the nations, which nowadays, when we look back in hindsight, makes very little sense. So does that help with some of the families? Any more questions? There is a book on the Freemasons, and it's one of my sources here. If you look down here, there's Joy Porter. She has Native American Freemasonry, and it came out of the University of Nebraska Press, and she discusses in great detail how the Freemasons basically embedded themselves into many tribes throughout the United States. And the Masonic Lodge had a very prominent effect upon the destiny of many tribes. Ours is very clear to see how the Masonic Lodge came into play. Any more questions?
I have a question that sort of now springs from what you just said. A lot of the research that I've done, and I think many others have done as well, has taken a pretty long look at the ways that Native society was impacted by the colonials and then the early Americans in their efforts to dismantle the community structure of Native American society. And it would seem to me, one of my questions right now is, was this thrust of the Freemasons related to that in such a way that the sort of more patriarchal dominance that you would see in the culture of the Freemasons and in white dominant culture was one more way to dissipate and dismantle the matriarchal cultures that were dominant throughout Native American culture.
Short
That
answer,
might be a can of worms, but there it is. I just opened it.
yeah. The short answer to all of that is yes. The Masons had a lot of influence over what was happening within the traditions of the tribe, and the colonialism that came into play was in many ways blamed upon the Methodists and the Catholics. And yes, they did a lot of harm, but in particular, the Methodists also did quite a bit of good. So there's kind of an awkward balance between good and bad with the Methodists, but the Catholics, they did quite a bit of harm to many nations throughout North America because they continued on with that colonialism that hurt the tribes more so than it did in helping them. But one of the things that I tried to point out in some of the earlier slides here is the state of the clans, because we were a matrilocal society, which was kind of unique among all the nations in North America, except for the Iroquoian people. We're an Iroquoian people, we had a matrilineal society. Most of the other tribes out there, they were patrilineal. So they followed some of those natural intuitions, if you will, with colonialism, with the men being in charge, because the society that they were under, a lot of the Algonquians, the Siouan and others, they were already patrilineal. So that change of mindset within society wasn't as great and as difficult to do as it was with the Iroquoian people.
Forgive me, Lloyd, but I think that's a generalization because throughout the United States, all the way across the continent, there are still many, many tribes that were still matrilineal. And I'll just say that we don't have to discuss it, but that's just a point of information. And many tribes in the Southwest and in the Western United States. It even surprises me that you would consider that the Sioux were even that they were patriarchal. So I just, but we don't have to go into discussion. I know there isn't time for all that.
That is true, but there are a number of nations that were patrilineal. Even the Algonquian people, many of them were patrilineal, except a little bit of a difference there. The Delaware, the Lenape, they were matrilineal. So you had a mix in some of the different language groups, like the Algonquian, where you had patrilineal, matrilineal. So that is true, but there were a number of nations that were patrilineal. All of the Iroquoian people were matrilineal. You didn't have any differences within the Iroquoian like you saw within the Algonquian, where you had a mix of patrilineal, matrilineal. The Iroquoian people were exclusively matrilineal. And the Wyandot people in particular, we bore the brunt of a lot of the colonialism because we were a small nation compared to the other that became the Iroquoian Confederacy. When we left Ohio and Michigan, we had 650 citizens versus the other 6 nations that had thousands of citizens still on their rolls. So in order to achieve the ultimate goal, the loyalty to the clans, to the matrilineal society had to be destroyed. It had to be basically shut down. And that became the ultimate goal of the colonialism that found its way into our tribe. The clans stood as a barrier to the colonialism, and the clans had to be demolished and set aside. And that became a goal of the government once the clans the clan chiefs in 1828 were barred from participating within the tribal government.
Right. I agree with you about that.
Yeah. So one thing that I say in the new book, and many of you got a copy of the new book, I don't know if you've had a chance to read through much of it yet, but we were colonized. The Wyandot tribe was clearly colonized by the Europeans. That is undeniable. But what I think we need to open our minds to is to understand that we were also colonized by many of our own citizens within the tribe. So we were facing unprecedented pressure outside with the Europeans colonizing us from the outside, and we were facing unprecedented pressure from certain individuals within the tribe who were colonizing us internally. And it is an absolute amazing story when you look at the fact that we are still here today and our citizens were taking this unprecedented pressure outside and inside, and they refused to submit and die. They refused to give it all up. Even once the stability and the strength of the clans had been almost completely decimated, the clans went into hibernation basically to survive so that we could still be here today. And that identity of the clans, even though it was not in open display in society, it was kept in the hearts of the citizens. And many of us today, even though the clans are not truly functioning in the way that they should, we can still identify ourselves to our clans. So the clans were the primary target of the colonialism, and that was the only way to destroy the clans that the United States government could destroy the Wyandot tribe. And guess what? They failed.
Right.
So we still have to resist colonialism, and we still have to resist internal variations of colonialism that's within the tribe today. These are some hard topics, guys.
What's the next topic?
Um,
What
Uh,
did
the
you say,
next-
Dad?
The next topic that we had on the list was to discuss our relationship with some of the other tribes. How did we get along? Who was friend? Who was foe? Who did we recognize as those that we became dependent upon? And
I
we did become dependent upon one tribe for our survival. Actually two. The Delaware people, the Lenape, they replayed a big favor to us when we extended one to them in Ohio. And then once we got into Indian territory, the Shawnee, the Eastern Shawnee, they were irreplaceable friends for us. So the topic in December is supposed to be our relationship with other tribes and how we interfaced with them. And sometimes it got ugly. So any more questions about Wyandot
Well,
and Wyandotte?
There's the one other, I think probably even more challenging topic that we keep scratching at that maybe at some point we'll be willing to dive into, which is the slavery and African American stuff.
Yeah, I talk about that on the back of a turtle.
Yeah, your books are sitting right where I dropped them when I got home.
Well,
As you see, I'm in my office.
yeah. The tribe, unlike many other of the Iroquois peoples, the Wyandot people were against slavery. We did not accept slavery. Anyone that was brought into the tribe as a captive would have, under many definitions, been considered a slave. And everyone that was brought into the tribe, once they reached the age of understanding, they were given the opportunity to return to their birth people or stay within the Wyandot tribe as a citizen of the Wyandot tribe. So
Yeah,
we
You've
totally
said this
hated,
before.
yeah, we've totally hated the idea of slavery within the tribe, but that does not mean that many of our grandparents looked very favorably toward the African Americans. There were some very harsh things that were said about many of our citizens that were African American and how they were not looked favorably upon. In a lot of the discourses and dialogue that we have, they were actually looked upon as being within our society the same way as what the American society, the Europeans, looked at the Indians. They looked at us as being barbarians and brutes and uncivilized. We looked at the African American people pretty much under the same views. So we detested slavery. We tolerated the African American community, and it eventually ended up biting us really hard once we moved to Indian territory, because then the split became freedom and slavery a lot more open in society once it became a issue within the United States. And we actually, in Indian territory, were very, very helpful with the Underground Railroad in getting a lot of African Americans to freedom. That's why Quindaro is there today. A lot of the African Americans who gained freedom eventually settled in the Quindaro area. And we were very instrumental in getting their freedom achieved as a tribe.
Lloyd? When
Yes.
when I came back to Wyandotte in 1960, I don't think we had a recognition. Can you fill in, could maybe one of these sessions fill in some of that history between 1888 and what happened up in to us losing and regaining our recognition in one of
Yeah.
your talks?
Yeah, in 1960, there was no Wyandot tribe. We had been basically terminated. I believe it was in what, 1955, 1954, we were terminated a second time. And that was not unique to us. Many of the tribes from coast to coast under the Eisenhower administration lost their recognition. We just happened to be one of them. And most of the smaller tribes, with exception to, the obvious big ones, the 5 civilized tribes, and many of the Lakota people, Nakota, Pueblo, Navajo, they were big enough that they did not lose their recognition. But almost every single small tribe from coast to coast through the Eisenhower administration lost federal recognition, which President Jimmy Carter reinstated the Wyandot tribe and several others in 77? We were reinstated.
78.
Yes. Yeah. So in 1960, we did not exist as a tribe.
It was
But-
my understanding that that was part of that was because there wasn't any structured governance at that point for the tribal community as a nation, and that there was effort going on within the tribal citizenry to create that government structure so that they could be reestablished. I remember our grandfather going constantly to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Riverside, California. Every time he came to visit us, he would go meet with people at the BIA. This was Kenneth Walker, who was trying to work with other people in Oklahoma to try and see if they could get the government organized so that we could regain our tribal status. That's how it was explained to me by our grandfather when I was a little kid.
From the very, very, very late 1890s into the early 20th century, there's a gap, a very short gap in there where we can't really easily identify a chief.
Right.
There is about a 20-year gap where it's pretty silent as to who was actually in charge of tribal government. But throughout most of the 20th century, we can identify a chief. We elected a chief from the 38 Constitution, and the Wyandot tribe, Wyandotte, the Wyandot tribe can show in the records where even during the years of termination, we continue to elect and recognize a head chief as well as a council. Even though we technically weren't recognized, we still tried to organize ourselves, and it was not very good because there were a number of years where a number of citizens didn't show up in order to have quorum, in order to actually hold council. So we were severely struggling. Many of the chiefs were working out of their homes. There was not a place for them to actually come and work out of as a tribal office. Because of that, we were reinstated as a tribe a second time. Whereas the Wyandot Nation of Kansas, they have a hard time all the way from when Matthew Mudeater relinquished his position as head chief of the Citizen Party Wyandot in 1871, I believe. He relinquished that position all the way from 1870s until 1954, I believe. The Wyandot Nation of Kansas cannot show where they had a viable chief with the government. So that is 100 years thereabout where they do not have a tribal government that they can call and say, this is who we were at that time. That's why they cannot achieve federal recognition. They cannot show that continuum of tribal government. We can show the continuum of tribal government, but it was not functioning very good. But the fact that we did have a chief is why we are still here today. We showed that we never gave up, even though it was some very difficult times. we never gave up trying to get the people together in order to recognize the chief and put together a tribal council.
Because the US government considers tribes political organizations.
Correct. And in a lot of ways, that political organization has morphed a little bit in the 21st century from being a political organization into a corporate organization. We are, in many of the nations, are recognized more today as a corporation with a board of directors than we are as a tribal government with a chief. It's changing again into corporations. We're not a corporation. We're a sovereign nation of people. Good stuff here, guys. A lot of things that we could sit and talk about, and we've been going for,
I need to go home.
yeah, yeah. So is everybody good to go ahead and call it quits tonight? We
Yeah,
still have
that
a
was
few
very
people
good,
here.
Lloyd. Thank you.
Okay,
Those are my-
Thank you, Lloyd.
you're welcome. We'll see everybody next month, and we'll talk about relationships with other nations.
Thank you.
See you later.
Appreciate
Good to see
it.
everybody.
Renee,
Did you get what I gave Kim for you?
I haven't seen him yet.
Oh, okay.
I have it in my office. I did tell him I had something and he said,